My name is Enrique Ochoa. I'm Professor of History and Latin American Studies here at Cal State University, Los Angeles. I teach a broad range of classes in Mexican history and Central American history, in history of social movements, contemporary movements, food justice struggles in Latin America, and revolution in the Third World. The history of the sanctuary movement starts in the 1980s when we have a large number of Central American and Mexican migrants coming into the U.S. And they're coming into the U.S. at a time in which there's a growing feelings of xenophobia and policies that are being passed to exclude them. And in that process, then there were various folks, including people from the churches, the Christian churches, as well as the Catholic Church, Jews, and other and labor unions and the like, who were working to help these migrants come into the U.S. and to find peace. Many of them were fleeing Central American wars and revolutions and were refugees. The main issue was that the U.S. was not declaring them and seeing them as refugees. The U.S. was making the case that these folks were economic migrants and therefore undocumented or illegal, quote-unquote, immigrants. And because of that, then there really was no place for them to go. And so different social movements emerged that loosely can be called the sanctuary movement, that helped to find places for them, harbor people inside churches, inside other areas, and provide them shelter and the like. So the historical context for the sanctuary movement really has to be put in the context of the Cold War in the U.S. and in Central America, and the particular role that the U.S. played in Central America. The U.S. in the 1970s and really in the 1980s under the Reagan administration poured massive amounts of money into Central America to help the military defeat social movements. And these social movements were movements for social justice, movements that were revolutionary movements that were trying to address the deep inequalities that existed in Central America, the poverty, the dominance and reliance upon the U.S. And so many of these social movements and revolutionary movements then emerged and were really trying to open things up. In the process, the U.S. worked to stifle that. And therefore, as a result, large numbers of people were forced to flee. Many fled into Mexico, and then a good number as well would continue their journey into the U.S., into the L.A. area, into the Southwest in particular. U.S. history and U.S. policy in the 1980s really needs to be seen in a much larger context in Central America. Central Americans are migrating largely because there's a deep connection between the U.S. and Central America. As early as the 19th century, the U.S. was already trying to play a very strong role in Central America. We begin to see U.S. intervention as early as the 19th century with U.S. capitalists going abroad, going into Central America, trying to find ways to extract resources. In the early 19th century, Cornelius Vanderbilt will help to create a land route to take people from the U.S. East Coast all the way to California during the gold rush. This will lead to William Walker, a U.S. citizen, taking over Central America and declaring himself president for a couple years. Fast forward to the late 19th century with U.S. intervention and the arrival of the Marines, and the Marines will occupy various countries in Central America. Nicaragua, for example, from 1909 all the way to 1933. The U.S. will also have deep ties and provide military assistance to governments to help prop up the governments, largely because there are U.S. businesses, U.S. mines, banana companies, sugar companies that are there. And so the U.S. really begins to see Central America as part of its backyard. As a bunch of governments that are not able to take care of themselves. They see them, the U.S. sees them in kind of a racialized way, in a racist way, of kind of backwards folks who aren't able to fully do this. That leads to, again, deep intervention during that dollar diplomacy period of the 1890s all the way to the 1920s. It means continued intervention during the good neighbor policy under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, where no longer is the U.S. directly intervening by bringing the military, right? The U.S. withdraws the Marines from the area, but instead then supports strongman dictators who are carrying out still the similar policies that the U.S. is interested in providing stability for U.S. businesses to extract labor and stopping reform efforts, right, to expand the rights of workers, expand the benefits to indigenous people. And so the U.S. has this very long history in Central America that really shifts the gaze of much of Central America away from Latin America to then begin to look at the U.S. So that even though the U.S. is intervening and in many ways forcing people to leave their lands, the U.S. is the logical place for people to go because there's already this deep history of familiarity with U.S. culture, with U.S. society, and so people will begin to migrate. Central Americans were migrating to the U.S. right as early as the early 1900s, and in San Francisco by the 1930s and 1940s, there's already a sizable Central American population. In Los Angeles, it's not as large as it is in San Francisco, but it is a significant population. So that when people are forced off their lands, when they're forced out because of the brutality of the military dictatorships, because of the 1980s, then the logical place to come is the U.S. This is where they have familial ties. This is where they have already a familiarity of the culture. So one might argue it's kind of a boomerang effect that's happening. So the boomerang effect that begins to happen is that because of this long history of migration, of this long history of U.S. intervention and then consequential migration, is when in the 1970s and 1980s we see the rise of revolutionary movements in Central America. The Nicaraguan revolutionary movement in the 1970s that really then takes power in 1979, and then other revolutionary movements in El Salvador and in Guatemala that begin to really gain support among peasants, among workers. This leads to the U.S. Fostering and pouring in more money into the militaries of these countries to stifle these movements. And this stifling of these movements, leads to the escalation of murders, the disappearance of large numbers of people throughout the 1970s until 1982. Approximately 70,000 people in El Salvador would be killed and disappeared. 88% of which, would be by the military. In Guatemala, the number is about 200,000 people. Really, genocidal violence occurs in the countryside aimed at largely indigenous Mayan people. And all that is heavily supported with U.S. funds, U.S. military training, supported largely by the Reagan administration. And then the Reagan administration, when even the U.S. Congress says, no, we have to put a stop to that, and the Democrats begin to pass laws in the early 1980s, the Reagan administration then looks for other ways to fund the troops. Mm-hmm. The Iran-Contra effort, working to make deals in the Iran-Iraq war and get money from Iran and then feed that into the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua, which will escalate the war. There's all kinds of evidence now that we know of the CIA working with drug lords in Colombia to help to use Central America as a conduit to funnel those drugs there and then use U.S. and CIA operations to bring the drugs into the U.S. And in return, the U.S. will ship arms back into those areas. That will lead to the explosion of inexpensive, right, crack cocaine in U.S. urban cities, in Los Angeles, for example, and it will also lead to growing amounts of money and arms for counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua, and in the process, that'll lead to greater displacement. So this will lead to right, large amounts of migration, people having to flee and coming into the U.S. However, because of U.S. Cold War policy, the argument is that since they're leaving countries like Guatemala, like Honduras, like El Salvador, that are friendly to the U.S., in which the U.S. is supporting the government in their fight against supposed communism, then these migrants must be economic migrants. They may be coming here for jobs and to take U.S. jobs, quote unquote, and because of that, they're seen as not fleeing dictatorship. They're instead seen as fleeing right, a bad economic situation. At the same time, people leaving Nicaragua and leaving Cuba would be seen as people fleeing communist, and therefore would be more likely to get refugee status. So there's this double standard policy, and it's largely connected to U.S. foreign policy. The ambassador, the Reagan ambassador to the United Nations, Jean Kirkpatrick, professor of international relations at Georgetown University, had this doctrine that she first articulated in the 1980s about dictatorships and double standards. That there are two different kinds of dictatorships. There are authoritarian dictatorships and then totalitarian dictatorships. She argued totalitarian dictatorships were ones in so-called communist countries. They were seen as more evil dictatorships in her view, as opposed to authoritarian dictatorships, which were more, which were still brutal but not quite as brutal, and they were allied with U.S. values and the U.S. They were our friends, and therefore that they should be treated differently. And that this double standard played out in U.S. policy in Central America, and it played out in immigration policy. Since the vast majority of people that were coming, especially in the LA area, were coming from El Salvador and Guatemala, were fleeing those dictatorships, but yet were not recognized by the U.S., then they were seen as undocumented immigrants, and there was a large effort then to try to exclude them from the country. And because of that, and because there were a large number of people who knew the history of the U.S. in Central America, because of the anti-war movement in Vietnam, right, had ended right by the mid-1970s, there was still a large consciousness of folks who were saying U.S. foreign policy was creating another Vietnam for the U.S. in Central America. No Vietnam War in Central America was a slogan that was oftentimes said. And because of that, many of those same anti-war protesters then began to call out the U.S.'s policy, especially during the Reagan era, where that was scaled up. Many folks were then organizing, and they saw the connection between migration and U.S. foreign policy. That then leads to people then not just protesting the U.S., but recognizing, hey, there are people coming, we need to do something to help these folks for our sins, for the sins of the U.S. that are being committed, that's creating this. And then, yes, this will lead to many different churches beginning to open their sanctuaries up. And many of those churches then would be influenced by liberation theology coming out of the Vatican in the 1960s, and then among the Latin American bishops that would say that instead of the church supporting the wealthy and those in power, that the church should be supporting the poor, that there should be a preferential option for the poor, and that the church should really be working in the name of Jesus to help those who are being most exploited in society. And so many of those churches then began to practice that by opening their churches up. So in Los Angeles, right, there are a number of key actors in the sanctuary movement. Among the very first really to begin to open up the churches was some of the Catholic Church within the Catholic diocese. Not necessarily the Catholic diocese as a whole, but individual priests. So, for example, one of the big movements really was along the Plaza Overa, the Placita Church on Overa Street at this point. By the early 1980s, Father Luis Olivares would become the parish priest there, and he was somebody who had a social justice bent, had connection, was a Mexican American, had connections as well with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union, and began to see the migration occurring in Mexico and in Central America, and many of his parishioners around Overa Street, right, were from those areas. And he, in LA, right, would be hearing about what other churches are beginning to do in other places, trying to open up their churches as a form of sanctuary. Father Olivares connected to other of the solidarity groups. At this point, there were a growing number of solidarity groups that were in solidarity with the people of El Salvador, for example, CISPES, the Coalition in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. There were a number of other groups that were working in support of the Nicaraguan Revolution, and they were all here. And so between those solidarity groups and the church, there were, again, numerous demonstrations throughout the early 1980s, and that began to coalesce then into a movement, on the one hand, in which churches were very active in the sanctuary aspect. And they were oftentimes working right alongside and with some of the solidarity movements. In Los Angeles, there will be also refugee centers that will begin to develop, and I'm thinking of Carecen, the Central American Refugee Center in Los Angeles, that will start as a refugee center. Over time it'll change, and so now it's called the Central American Resource Center, but early on it was created by Central Americans with allies who were Chicano allies, that were white allies, that were other progressive African Americans and others, to form a basis to help the refugees as they were coming. They would create as well the Clínica Romero, after the Archbishop Oscar Romero, to have a medical clinic in which people could receive medical treatment, especially in many cases people were coming who were tortured victims, so to get medical aid, as well as to find counseling services and psychological services because of the trauma in which people were fleeing. Another important group would be El Rescate, the rescue, that would also form in the 1980s and be an important hub for the community, a hub that would also reach out to different Central American refugees and provide support, and be a center for solidarity to teach other people in the LA community about these groups. So the sanctuary movement in the 1980s is very significant in U.S. history and in Los Angeles history as well. It's significant because right here you have a coming together of Central American activists, of Chicano activists, of African Americans, of white activists who come together to support groups that are coming in that are fleeing violence and are fleeing U.S. foreign policy. People who are literally the victims of U.S. foreign policy. And there is a strong solidarity support that really is kind of like a bottom-up foreign policy of the U.S. That is, people from below reaching out, contrary to what the U.S. government is doing, and reaching out and helping. Kind of a people-to-people foreign policy. And that makes it really unique and significant. I say unique in the way that we tend not to see it. When we discuss U.S. foreign policy, we tend to look more at the state and the statecraft of foreign policy, government-to-government relationships, and less at people-to-people relationships. And of course, if we go throughout U.S. history, there are numerous other examples of this. But here we see it very clearly. It's also significant because it's also a place right in the 1980s, during the midst of the Reagan administration, where there seems to be a rightward shift in the country, where we have a period in which the idealism and the activism of the 60s and 70s is now being undone through a whole series of policies. anti-affirmative action policies, policies that were trying to gut any of the social gains during the 1980s, Reaganomics and the economics of neoliberalism being put in, where it seemed to be that there was no real opposition to this. The sanctuary movement, in connection with the solidarity movement, right, is a coming together of oppositional movements to the Reagan administration, of where we're seeing people begin to organize and connect and make connections along these lines. This will help to revitalize, in many ways, the labor movement later on in the next decade. It'll help to revitalize the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the next couple of decades, because it's a place where people are beginning to draw connections between U.S. policy, its economic policy, and its foreign policy, and the community there. So it's an important, really, place of resistance and opposition. So the 1980s sanctuary movement is an area that scholars and historians have not written much about. For several reasons. One, because it's 1980s, it's seen as kind of too contemporary, and because I think that people are beginning to address it. Some of the early writing on the sanctuary movement was done by journalists who were writing about what was happening and beginning to document the movement as a whole. The churches and the like, they early on then would draw parallels to what might be argued as one of the first sanctuary movements in U.S. history, and that's the Underground Railroad, the effort, right, to help enslaved people flee the enslaved South and find sanctuary in the North, even as, right, there are many cases they were persecuted in the North, but oftentimes to get people to Canada, right, drawing connection. Many of those early journalists began to draw those connections. Some of the other folks who began to write about it were anthropologists and sociologists who were following, who were doing ethnographic work and following some of the movements. The work of Susan Coutinho on the sanctuary movement in Arizona is a good example of this and its connection with the church. They're also, again, not directly talking about sanctuary, but connected to it is the growing literature on the solidarity movement, on the Central American solidarity movement that was happening in the U.S. and in particular in the Southwest and New York and the bigger cities, where scholars have begun, right, to document that and to talk about the way in which folks were organizing and how that connects to other social movements going on. Some of that literature has touched upon the work with sanctuary movements. A very recent work that's come out has been by Mario Garcia. Mario Garcia is professor of history and Chicana studies at UC Santa Barbara, which is a biography of Luis Olivares, who, right, was the parish priest at the Mission Church in the Plaza Overa, one of the foremost proponents of sanctuary. And he provides really an outstanding biography of Luis Olivares, of his work, of how he came to do the work of sanctuary in LA in the 1980s and the way that connects to the other social movements. So at this point, that's one of the most important works that are out there, dealing with the period of the 1980s that historians are doing. And then there are a number of other scholars who are beginning to document the sanctuary movement from the perspective of what was happening in different areas and the role of different groups involved in it. And so that literature is beginning to emerge. One of the limitations of a lot of that literature is that it's focused very much on the U.S. And historians are some of the big culprits here, right? Because oftentimes we teach U.S. history as if the U.S. is an exceptional country, as if the U.S. is not connected to the rest of the world, and if it is, it's only at the relations of governmental relationships and war. And so we have very few transnational histories of both solidarity and sanctuary. And by that what I mean is the impact, the formation of these movements in the U.S., but how they are also informed by Central American activists who had who had deep histories and were coming with deep histories and political experiences, and the way in which then their U.S. history intersects with Central American history, and those connections. And again, I think that's an area that historians, and I think in the classroom, we need to push. That this is about U.S. history, but it's also really about U.S. and Central American history and the way it's connected. And so again, trying to see it in a more transnational way breaks the way we tend to see history in this very nationalist way. The U.S. history and then the Central American history, and then they intersect a little bit in certain periods of time, and then they don't. Well, those of us, right, who are Central American in the U.S., right, and from other areas know that our histories are transnational, that we're connected still deeply in a variety of ways with Central America. And so again, the move towards the historiography has been to talk about transnationalism, but we haven't really seen that fully carried out yet. So the history of this period is also significant as well, because this is where we see the rise of a Central American population in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, even in other places within the U.S. This is where largely the Latino population, the Latinx population, has been largely Mexican in the U.S., and it still remains that way, especially in California. However, we begin to see the rise of a strong Central American student population, and we see that in schools, even beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, but even now we have large areas of the state in which there's Central American students alongside Mexican students, and oftentimes and historically, right, that's not recognized. We don't hear the stories of them. There are a series of silences around Central American students. The UCLA professor Leslie Abrego has called these various silences because really we don't hear the story about them. Many of the Central American students then haven't heard their history and their stories because their parents fled war. They fled the trauma of war. They came here in a period of xenophobia in which other traumas were inflicted on them. And as a way of trying to create peace for their kids, to not inflict that on their kids, oftentimes did not tell them the story. And therefore it becomes kind of invisibilized. It becomes a silence. At the same time, in the U.S. and U.S. schools, we historically do not teach, right, about people of color. We do not teach about, one might argue, relevant history, how history is directly connected to our struggles and to where we are. And what little gets taught tends to be on Mexican American studies, and even that it's very little. And so there's another silence that happens in the literature. And again, it's extremely important to begin to break those silences, right? And that helps us to begin to see that there are various different stories in the room. It makes us also begin to think of where this knowledge comes from, who's creating this knowledge that's in the textbooks, and that beginning to see as well that our families, that our communities are sources of that knowledge, and that we need to kind of open things up and figure out ways to get these stories there. So students see themselves reflected in the history. That's a key component, but also so we can begin to really truly practice a democratic praxis in society where we begin to see the various stories and histories there, draw commonalities, recognize differences, so that we could really, right, fulfill the goal of public education, and that's to create kind of citizens and students who are thoughtful, who are thinking, and who are engaged, and who know about the world around them. So it's also very important to teach this subject, right, because it really confronts the very hard history, the very hard realities of U.S. history. And again, as we're trying to think of and foster and instill in our students a critical thinking skills and the ability to understand, right, the complex history of the U.S., it's very important that we confront history and confront U.S. history. And so it's really behooves us to go into and study these different perspectives that are there, to understand various aspects of the history. And again, that may make people uncomfortable initially, right? As we teach about subjects that maybe go against the grain of our training, go against the grain of politics, it may seem as if we are raising things that shouldn't be talked about, that maybe are unpatriotic. On the contrary, right, again, a democratic society should be discussing this material, even though it may make us, right, feel uncomfortable, to have students reading the primary sources of what's going on, to seeing videos about the topic, allowing the story to emerge from those affected by it, right? Finding different sources to get that story out is extremely important, again, for a basic understanding of how U.S. society is like, and as a way of humanizing us and recognizing that these different histories exist, that we don't always agree on the interpretation, but that we need to hear them and we need to talk about them. So the sanctuary movement of the 1980s has a lot of connections to what we see going on today in terms of Central American migration that we've been seeing, especially since 2014, and the large numbers of people who've had to flee countries like El Salvador, like Guatemala, and Honduras, and come to the U.S. in large numbers, fleeing violence, fleeing gang violence that oftentimes, right, is connected with the deep history to the U.S., and that are now being kind of brandished as people who are fleeing, people who are seen as illegal aliens again, and the rhetoric of the administration as we speak now, right, is one that's very harsh against the migrations, that's criminalizing them and seeing them in a very one-dimensional way without understanding the complexities that really are there, and we can see that in a lot of different ways. First of all, using the sanctuary, the discussion of the sanctuary and the solidarity movement in the 1980s, we could begin to see that people are being forced out of their homelands, again, in ways that are connected to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. economic policy. Economic policies that have shifted the economy in ways that have kind of done away with work for the majority of people, and are pushing people out to find other jobs, but also pushing people to find other ways of making money, and the growth of gangs in the U.S. That is the deportation of Central American youth in the U.S. who were in places like L.A. and others, who, in order to struggle to survive, had to form their own gangs, their own ways of making connections as they were deported in larger numbers because of changes in U.S. immigration law in the 1990s and the 2000s. But initially under the Clinton administration, as they were deported to Central America, going to countries that had seen deep civil war, that had never fully recovered from the war, that had not talked about it, so adding trauma upon trauma in an economy that was not providing jobs for people. Then finding other ways of earning a living, finding other families, right, will lead to growing crime and violence that are connected to the gangs. And that is very closely connected to U.S. policy. And so again, some of the language of the sanctuary movement, the language of the solidarity movement, having us see the connection is very relevant for today. The other important part here is we've been hearing for the past year and a half or so, right, the government the administration railing against so-called sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. And again, the language of sanctuary, right, has been used by activists, by other immigrant rights activists, by other folks who are supportive of addressing the needs of refugees. And so the sanctuary movement that we see now, yes, has its resonance to the one of the 1980s, where some of the same folks were then trying to say, okay, well, we have these folks who are refugees, who are fleeing violence. The administration is seeing them as economic refugees, and we're seeing kind of rhetoric and growing activity by ICE and Border Patrol to round communities up, to round families up, to separate families. Therefore, we need to do something to protect them. And so using the languages of sanctuary, many cities have them passed sanctuary laws to ensure that the police do not work with ICE to deport people who've already served their time. That we draw from a lot of the legacy of Los Angeles during the sanctuary movement, in which the city council made sure that the LAPD in the 1980s did not work with ICE, to draw from that history and create similar laws. And those have been very important and very symbolic and important that we see. There's some differences in that this sanctuary movement of the 1980s really was born of struggle, where people on the ground doing it on their own, whether it was the churches, whether it was a solidarity movement, it was being done despite the government. In the contemporary period, that is also occurring, but the movement is not as strong. That is, there are not as many folks kind of on the ground pushing this. Instead, what we have is some activism around it, but we also have places like in California where there are many liberal Democrats in power who then remember those times and are trying to pass legislation. And so the movement is not as strong, but yet there are people in place that kind of help that along. And so that's while that's important, and that is definitely crucial for people in many different ways, there's not as much still movement and mobilization around in support of immigrants and of refugees. And again, what that means in the long term, we'll see. But with the current sanctuary movement, right, at this point, there is an effort there are connections being made. There are important connections being made by people who are immigrant rights activists, and they're seeing what's happening. The administration, in its rhetoric, has also mobilized other communities, and there is then more cooperation going on and greater discussion that we see going on. At this point, there's a growing movement or a poor people's campaign that's happening, that's taking up the banner of Dr. King and his Poor People's March. And in those discussions, working people, white, black, Asian, from different regions are talking about immigrants as well, and beginning to see that. So again, there are signs of that similar coalition possibly being made. And this is also important for the contemporary period because at this point there are significant numbers of Central Americans coming in to the U.S. at the time that we have large Central American populations within the U.S. And so again, to be able to understand this history and Central American history and Central Americans in the U.S., to be able to understand how the administration received them and how the people received them in the sanctuary movements is extremely important for understanding what's happening now and what's possible. And beginning to make connections between that history and the potential other acts of solidarity that schools are doing, that students are doing with Central American students coming in. We now have community organizations that emerged from that 1980s sanctuary movements. And in Los Angeles, for example, Homies Unidos has been long working with people who were in the MS-13 gang, who were in 18th Street gang, working with youth in that community as a way of kind of talking to them about history and community and culture, and that has been one of the most important organizations at this point that has been reaching out to the youth who are coming now. Every year they have a very large Central American Youth Conference where they connect communities and they connect students who've been here and their families have been here for 30 or 40 years with new arrival students, to be able to provide them with some sanctuary, some understanding, some communication, to make those connections that were not there for those who were fleeing war in the 1980s.